Jerusalem is the universal city, the chosen city, the holy city. That's its blessing, but it also gives it its danger and its ugliness too. Because it means that people believe that they must possess it, absolutely.
The Palestinian-Israeli conflict that we are experiencing today, you've seen it experienced in Jerusalem for thousands of years.
For the Jews, Jerusalem is where Solomon built the Holy Temple.
For Christians, this is the place where Jesus was crucified.
For Muslims, Jerusalem is where the Prophet Muhammad made the night journey.
People are said to have conquered the world, have swept through the city.
No other individual changed the landscape in the way that Herod the Great did.
Saladin was determined to take on the Christians and throw them out of Jerusalem.
At a time of Ottoman Islamic rule, the British badly wanted to control the Holy Land.
The main case of the Arabs is against the British government's policy in Palestine.
We are the only people in the world, homeless and stateless.
For Israelis, the creation of the State of Israel is seen as a miracle. And of course, for the Palestinians, it's a great disaster.
The history of Jerusalem, a very complicated story. And if you don't know it in its complexity, it's very hard to understand what's going on there today.
The past is never dead. And if there is a city in the world to which that applies, it's Jerusalem.
"18 years have passed since the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. After a period of calm, tensions are rising again in the Middle East. The young nation of Israel struggles to find stability as the entire region hovers on the brink of a new conflict.
Israel is still a very young country. The idea of accepting Israel as part of the Middle East is foreign.
Israel and its Arab neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, were at a state of conflict since 1948. The Middle East was Arab for at least 2,000 years, and suddenly these immigrants come from Eastern Europe and they build their own community here. And it was the new island of foreigners in the midst of an Arab Middle East.
At this time, the Palestinian refugee situation from the 48 war is not resolved.
There were three kinds of Palestinian refugees at the time: West Bank, Gaza, and then there were the Palestinians who were living inside Israel who stayed there after the 1948 war.
Many Palestinians are still longing to go back to their homes. They're still carrying the keys to their homes in Haifa, in Jaffa, and of course in Jerusalem.
Jerusalem itself was divided between Israel and Jordan, which was the result of the war in 1948.
Jerusalem was a Berlin-like divided city. In most of the areas, it wasn't a wall, it was mounds of concertina, barbed wire.
And when Jordan occupied the old city of Jerusalem, the Jews were not allowed in the city, and the old community of the Jews were essentially kicked out of their houses.
While Jordan restricts Jews from accessing their holy sites, the king of Jordan desires peace with Israel.
King Hussein was a very smart, shrewd man, and he understood the red lines of the different power dynamics in the region. At the same time, maintaining his close relationships with England and with Israel.
He was a very British, westernized figure. He had all the sort of manners and charm of the traditional English gentleman.
But there were lots of skepticism and distrust towards him from lots of Arabs as a friend to the Jews. So in the 1960s, he was really in a very weak position in the Arab world.
King Hussein is also the grandson of the leader who captured Jerusalem during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War.
Abdullah, the Hashemite king of Jordan, achieved something quite significant when he took the West Bank and half of Jerusalem, which rightfully was land that belonged to the Palestinian state. But it's a dangerous thing to play with Jerusalem, and he paid a high price.
To the old city of Jerusalem, King Abdullah went for the Friday prayers. Among his own people, he walked unguarded and unafraid. But there were those who hated him, and as the king entered the mosque to pray, a young fanatic killed the one man who might have brought peace to the Middle East.
So Abdullah was assassinated by a Palestinian who viewed Abdullah as disloyal to the Palestinian cause, which was the Palestinian independent state. And King Hussein was with him as his grandson when he was assassinated in Jerusalem.
Suddenly I saw someone rush from behind a door to the right side with a revolver in his hand. And before anyone could do anything, he fired a shot. My grandfather was hit and fell. It was a shock. I tried to rush for the man, and he turned and fired. I received a bullet that ripped off a medal off my chest.
There's a story that King Abdullah, before he was assassinated, pinned a medal on Prince Hussein's chest. And it was that medal that saved his life.
As King Hussein and Jordan search for stability, the rest of the Arab world follows the lead of a very different kind of ruler.
The most powerful regime in the Arab world was Egypt. President Nasser was essentially, almost for lots of Arabs, someone who is equivalent to the Prophet Muhammad. He was extremely influential. He could, by just a word, topple a regime.
Gamal Abdel-Nasser was the leader of Egypt since 1956.
He was over 6 foot tall. He was incredibly handsome. He was decisive. He was a superb speaker who could wow giant crowds.
And he inspired tens of millions of Arabs throughout the region, saying that a new dawn for the Arab world was coming.
There was a sense that finally somebody is standing up and defying imperialism, especially the 160-something thousand Palestinians who were left in Israel. Nasser gave them a sense of pride.
But he was offering them a glimpse of hope, and that I am coming to your aid. Fear not.
In Israel, when we looked at Nasser, he terrified us because the Israelis were quite confident that they can face any challenge from the Arab world as long as the Arab world is not united.
Nasser wants to be the one who's going to unify all these different Arab states that are slowly coming from under the influence of the British mandate. And to do that, he needed to turn to Israel as the enemy.
The most fundamental common denominator in the Arab world at the time was the hatred toward Israel. So Nasser used this in order to gain popularity.
He wants to give his audience excitement. He wants to move them. But does he really want to fight a war?
Nasser didn't really want to go to war. He was afraid of a defeat. King Hussein didn't want a war. The Israelis didn't want a war. But then something very drastic happened.
Hostilities are mounting across the Middle East. But while every country wants to avoid an outright war, a faction of Palestinian Arabs are done waiting for their own independent state.
On the Palestinian side, there was a rising organization that was formed in the earlier part of the 1960s that came to be known as a PLO, that was meant to bring under its umbrella the diverse Palestinian movements that were taking matters to their own hands.
The PLO is using the territory around Israel to sort of launch these small military campaigns. I think terrorism is horrible. I don't think it's helped the Palestinian cause. But this is a history that Palestinians understood well. Israel took this land by force, and it can only be returned by force. And that was the justification for the terrorism and the violence.
In November 1966, they laid a mine and an Israeli command car was destroyed, and 3 Israeli soldiers were killed. Following this incident, Israel took what we call an act of retaliation against the Jordanian because it was near the Jordanian-Israeli border in the West Bank. There was a battle with Jordanian soldiers. About 30 or 40 Jordanian soldiers were killed. And it was a major issue because the Jordanians saw the Israeli victory and they started asking, where is Nasser? He promised to be our protector, but he doesn't do anything. So this incident led Nasser to react militarily.
In response to mounting pressure, President Nasser blocks Israel's access to the Straits of Tiran, preventing Israel from receiving valuable oil shipments.
Nasser thought that he could employ new tactics by closing the Straits of Tiran, where 90% of the oil at the time was coming in. He could pressure the Israelis into caving. And so his assessment at the time was war would not happen. There's no way the Israelis would declare war.
From the Israeli perspective, we declared that if he closes the straits, we go to war. Then suddenly he closed them. And here we have a crisis.
With conflict seemingly inevitable, Nasser recognizes it's time to finally unite the Arab Middle East under his command.
Nasser started to build an alliance with lots of regimes in order to make sure he has everything ready for that epic battle.
If Nasser says, get in line, you got to pay attention to that.
King Hussein did not want a war, but he had no choice but to side with Nasser. He is a descendant of the Prophet. He's a defender of Arab Muslim causes. He cannot sit on the sidelines. So he was pushed into this war, whether he wanted it or not.
The most significant development of the week in terms of Arab unity came on Tuesday. King Hussein of Jordan, usually called a Western stooge and a CIA agent by President Nasser's propaganda services, flew to Cairo to sign a 5-year mutual defense pact with Egypt.
On May 30, Nasser reached his goal, which was to command the Arab world. Once an Arab United Command had been established and the Arab generals started to coordinate their acts, then we felt that the situation is really dangerous, and many Israelis started to be afraid for the fate of the country.
Don't forget that this is barely 22 years after the Holocaust. There are armies gathering on our borders. The fear was genuine.
אנשים גם כדרך עם ישראל עטו על השווקים, על הסופרים, ומילאו את הבית, וקנו, כמו לפני מלחמה.
The Israeli government is just as fearful.
Traditionally, in Israel, the prime minister was also the minister of defense. Our Prime Minister in 1967 was Levi Eshkol, who was a very good finance minister, but he had no background in military issues. Once the crisis started, it was clear that Eshkol is not the leader that you want in a war. And all eyes turned to the charismatic Moshe Dayan.
Dayan was one of the most complex and enigmatic figures in Israeli history, full of contradictions.
He was a rogue and a hero at the same time. It was said that he had 100 ideas an hour, and out of those, 99 would be dangerous and one would be brilliant.
He lost his eye in the Second World War. Then his patch became a symbol. So here you have a legend born.
Today, Israeli armor is facing a group of Arab countries united by defense agreements and in a far stronger position to sweep Israel into the sea.
Nasser and his allies thought that this would be a decisive victory. It would enable us to defeat the Israeli forces and move in to claim more land from the Israelis.
But Dayan's philosophy is, you hit them first, you hit them hard, and you hit them right in the mouth. And if you can knock them out, you've already won.
Dayan's opening salvo will launch what becomes known as the Six-Day War. War threatens the entire Middle East, and Israel finds itself surrounded by enemies.
Nasser had been broadcasting that they were going to throw Israel into the sea and that they were ready to attack. And at a particular date, Dayan said, "We've heard enough of this. We should attack first."
First strike was a strike by the Israeli Air Force, and the essence of this plan was to surprise the Egyptian Air Force by dropping bombs so that the Egyptian aircraft won't be able to take off.
In 1967, it was my 7th year of service in the Air Force. The whole Air Force actually took off with no one word on the radio. Nothing.
They managed to maintain the secrecy and to get their planes off the ground and to fly extremely low so that they were not detected by radar.
They swing the planes out over the water and then bring them in from the west.
We flew over the Mediterranean Sea at about 100 feet until the delta of the Nile. We pulled up at around 6,000 feet. We turned around 35 to 40 degrees of diving to make sure that the bombs hit the center of the runway. We made 3 passes with 30mm guns, and we were shooting planes like sitting ducks on the runways. There was about 400 Egyptian and Syrian jets being destroyed in this way, and they burned beautifully.
יום הראשון הופלו כל המטוסים המצריים, והניצחון הענק, וגם המעבר הזה מקושי נוראי לשמחה ענקית.
But Nasser still believes he can achieve victory, as long as his people don't lose their faith.
So the Arab media started broadcasting their version of the war, which wasn't realistic.
Nasser controlled the airwaves via radio. He could send his message out almost to every population around him. And the propaganda machine at the time was saying, victory, Israeli airplanes falling from the sky like flies.
While Nasser's propaganda spreads across the Middle East, Moshe Dayan launches the second wave of his attack on the Egyptian-controlled Sinai.
Now, Israel completely controlled the skies, and that rendered all the armies, the army of Syria, the army of Egypt, and even the army of Jordan, very weakly defended.
The goal was to occupy the Sinai and destroy the Egyptian army.
As the Israeli army started to advance toward Gaza, their first encounter with Egyptian forces was extremely bloody, and Israel lost several battalions. The casualties was extremely disheartening, and this could have fueled lots of acts of vengeance on the part of Israeli soldiers.
What the Israeli army did moving into Sinai, they created what they call a box fire. Basically, soldiers standing on this side of the box, soldiers standing on this side of the box, and then shooting everybody that stands right in the middle of that box or in the way of that box. So they showed no mercy to the Egyptian soldiers.
I know that there were cases like this. There were prisoners they didn't know what to do with because they had to move on. And there were cases where they shot prisoners. Compared to what the Egyptian and other Arab armies did to Israeli prisoners, it wasn't so bad.
Each side remembers the atrocities inflicted upon us. Neither side remembers the atrocities that we've perpetuated.
But the Israeli army used a massive force, and during the first 6-7 hours of the war, the Egyptian army collapsed.
King Hussein and President Nasser at the time were shocked and overwhelmed. And Nasser started believing that he's losing the war when he realized he lost Sinai.
And so he orders the Jordanians to begin shelling Jerusalem. And this is Nasser's first big move of the war.
King Hussein found himself in a situation where he didn't want to go to war, but now he had an Egyptian general commanding his forces, and an army started shelling West Jerusalem, Jewish Jerusalem.
נפלו פגזים והרסו חלק מהדירה. למזלם, הם שהו באמת במקלט באותם של דבר. היינו במקלטים.
The shelling is meant to target Jews in West Jerusalem, but it's the Palestinian Arabs living in the area that are left defenseless.
We didn't have a shelter, so my mother decided that the kids, that we should stay and not move from under the dining table. I was 7 years old at that time. I hear until now very vividly the bombs, the airplanes, the clashes.
Citizens were killed, Palestinian and Israeli. Everything stopped in Jerusalem. It started in the morning, continued through the afternoon, and towards the evening, it was clear that Jordanians mean war.
The war for the Middle East has come directly to Jerusalem. The battle for Jerusalem has begun. The Egyptian President Nasser is now in command of the Jordanian army and has given orders to shell West Jerusalem. Moshe Dayan looks to retaliate. He sets his sights on one of the most strategic locations in the city, Ammunition Hill.
Ammunition Hill. This is a big hill overlooking Jerusalem. The problem with taking Ammunition Hill is that the Jordanians know that this is an important strategic place as well. And so they're going to defend it, and it is already heavily armed.
The paratroopers were considered to be the best soldiers in the Israeli military. When you tell them to go to fight, they don't ask questions. They go to fight. It became a legendary fight for the Israelis. About 35 to 40 Israeli soldiers were killed in this fight, about 70 Jordanian soldiers. The paratroopers were told to occupy this stronghold, and it was a clear victory.
Once Ammunition Hill is under Israeli control, the Israeli army brings their fight deeper into Jerusalem. But it's the Palestinian Arabs that are left vulnerable.
They see, contrary to what they were hearing on the radio at the time, you know, we will defeat the Israeli presence, and then all of a sudden, it's completely the entire opposite. People start getting frantic, and again, another wave of refugees started marching towards Jordan.
By the morning of June 6th, the rest of the world finally wakes up to what's happening in the Holy City.
The US, the UN, European powers all had to find some way to lower the temperature and prevent the conflict from getting worse.
A special session of the Security Council called to discuss the Mideast crisis. Secretary General Uthant urges a cooling off period. The U.S. supports the idea, Russia does not. Soviet Ambassador Fedorenko gives solid support to the United Arab Republic, accusing the U.S. of playing partisan politics and of backing Israel.
The United States becomes much more interested in the Middle East around the mid-1940s to secure oil access. But with World War II and the ascendance of communism, you have a Cold War in the Middle East emerge, and you see the United States playing a much more pivotal role.
For those of us who didn't really grow up in the Cold War, it's hard to think of a time where a war in the Middle East could have led to nuclear annihilation. But at that time, in 1967, the two great superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, would use these regional struggles to advance their position.
So the Cold War played a very important role in defining the alliances in the Middle East. It gave Israel a chance to present itself as a friendly ally of the United States of America. It made it clear to Nasser that his closeness with the Soviet Union was seen as an invitation for the Soviet Union to have influence and presence in the Middle East.
So the United States started giving Israel tremendous powers, both in terms of financial support, but more importantly, through weapons.
And the Soviet Union didn't want to have a situation where the Israeli army was making like these really serious gains into Arab territory. There was always a fear that you weren't able to actually get the various parties to stop fighting, that there could be this ladder of escalation, and no one knew exactly when it would end.
We believe that within the next few fateful days, we can take a new road forward leading to justice and peace.
Diane realizes that if the UN does what the UN typically does, it is going to begin negotiations for a ceasefire. And so Diane figures he needs to do anything that he's going to do as quickly as he can before any final resolution is passed.
It was clear to him that Jerusalem is the jewel in the crown. And he knew that he's going to enter into the annals of history. If he could occupy the old city, to return to the Wailing Wall, the most sacred place for Jews.
So Dayan gives his soldiers the order: attack the old city of Jerusalem. Following Moshe Dayan's orders, Israeli soldiers prepare to attack Jerusalem's old city and battle the Jordanians for control of Jerusalem's holiest sites.
The Israeli troops set up outside the Lion's Gate. They're expecting this to be one of the fiercest battles of their lives.
The Lion's Gate is one of the 7 open gates of Jerusalem's old city and leads to the most sacred site for the Jewish people, the Temple Mount.
You know, it was battle. In a battle, what you want is to kill your enemy and save your life. And the Israeli soldiers moved very quickly into the city through the Lion Gate.
Intense fighting consumes the narrow streets of Jerusalem's old city. The Jordanian forces are quickly overwhelmed.
The Israeli soldiers suddenly found themselves near the Temple Mount.
And so Diane is just outside the old city, and he's got a radio, and finally he gets word back.
They understood that they occupied the old city of Jerusalem.
And at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Diane goes on camera and says, the Jewish people have returned to our most sacred sites, never to take leave of them again.
Soldiers who were not religious, who went directly to the Western Wall to pray. There was a lot of feeling, a lot of emotion.
We grew up on stories about King David and Jerusalem and the temple and the Wailing Wall, but these were only stories, and suddenly you are there.
It was like an electrical shock passing through the nation when they said that the Wailing Wall is ours again after 1,800 years.
With victory all but certain, Israel spends the next 3 days ensuring control of the region. They consolidate their hold on the West Bank and soon occupy the entire Sinai Peninsula in the south. Finally, on the northern front, Israel battles Syria for control of the Golan Heights.
And within 48 hours, the Syrian Golan Heights were occupied by the Israeli army. And this is when the Arab defeat was complete.
Egypt accepts the UN ceasefire, joining Jordan. The United Nations arena remains in the world spotlight because of the many questions raised by the short but decisive Middle East war.
As a Palestinian, it's amazing how sad it is for me, but how probably happy Israeli people were at that time.
Suddenly, this small state defeats 3 major Arab states in 6 days. This was considered one of the most brilliant victories in military history.
The Israeli victory affects far more than just the Middle East. It sends shockwaves across the world.
The main problem was for the Soviets, because the USSR was the protector of Egypt and of Syria, and it was a devastating defeat.
On the other side, America celebrates Israel's stunning victory, solidifying a relationship that continues today.
Later, Moshe Dayan became a Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he's remembered as a brilliant military leader.
But the picture of Moshe Dayan standing in front of the Wailing Wall is what cemented Moshe Dayan's legacy in Israeli psychology.
For King Hussein, the '67 war was a disaster. It was a total disaster.
King Hussein presented himself as the protector of Jerusalem, but he lost the Holy City, and he also lost the West Bank. So both politically and religiously, he became derided in the Muslim world.
Despite losing the war, King Hussein remains in power. He rules Jordan for 47 years, until his death in 1999.
The loss of 1967 also shattered the image of Nasser in the Arab world.
Nasser sees for the first time that this was a complete miscalculation. King of Jordan is very angry. He lost all of the West Bank to Israel. Syrians, they lost the Golan Heights. And the Egyptians who were in Gaza lost Gaza.
Nasser offered to resign in a very tearful speech to the Arab masses.
By 1970, Nasser would die of a heart attack.
That crumbles the dream of Arab nationalism, this idea that you could really unify these different peoples and countries and armies together and get them to have a common vision and a shared sense of destiny. After 67, you have to acknowledge that this is a divided region, and they were never able to really regain that sense of purpose again.
With Nasser, we loved him, but the loss of Egypt, and it was for him mistake, but for me, it cost me my freedom. It destroyed our dreams. We lost our country completely.
Even though war was declared in their name, the Palestinians were the ones who suffered the most. They were the casualty of a very brutal war that made them, again, refugees, made them, again, stateless, driven into poverty, uncertainty, to this day.
Israel has emerged victorious and claimed Jerusalem's old city. But Israel's victory also leads to a humanitarian crisis, as hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs are displaced or forced to live under occupation.
From the very beginning, there were a handful of people in Israel, particularly in Jerusalem, who said, give it all back. This is not something we need. We don't want to be occupiers. No one listened to them.
When they first took over the old city, they literally brought bulldozers in that night, and over 1,000 Arabs had their homes destroyed to build the plaza where people come and now pray. And nobody pays attention to the fact that there was this ethnic cleansing.
1967, I was a child. I lived it. I saw the agony and the transformation of my father's face. He became somebody else. My mother became somebody else. It has been very, very, very heavy on me, on my shoulders.
It's that sense of just complete disempowerment. That's the heavy burden that Palestinians carry. And it's 48, it's 67, it's today, it's happening today in East Jerusalem. This story hasn't ended.
The whole of Palestine continues to be eaten up like a cancerous disease, deleting, erasing, arresting, demolishing, and the world is silent again.
But I'll tell you that the discourse on Palestine has shifted. Students from all religious backgrounds, including Jewish backgrounds, are embracing the Palestinian cause. In many ways, it links into the Black Lives Matter movement, too, to sort of make it clear that one human shouldn't be privileged over the other simply because they were randomly born into a certain identity. My hope is that one day things will resolve themselves in Palestine, Israel, and we will be in a place where we live side by side and can visit Jerusalem together and learn from each other.
But at the end of the day, it's about real people living real lives. And that's where the focus ought to be. It's not, my God's better than your God. It's really about how we're treating each other on the ground.
Jerusalem was supposed to be the city of peace and of
cooperation between all nations all over the world. This was supposed to be the basic idea of Jerusalem. But there is an enormous gap between reality and the vision.
All great cities have pasts. Very few have pasts that figure so centrally in the narratives of the peoples in this region. How can you understand Judaism or Israel without a fundamental understanding of the Temple Mount? How can you understand Muslim sensitivities without understanding the Haram al-Sharif? And for Christians, without understanding Jesus' ascension and then the resurrection.
Everybody had a presence. Everybody had a claim. King David was there. King Herod was there. Arabs were there. Romans were there. It's equivalent of a magical place. A place that is more alive in your head, more alive in your identity.
Jerusalem in the 21st century is still, as it always was, the center of the world. Jerusalem will always be the holy city, the house of one God, the capital of two peoples, and the temple of three faiths.
Where'd you get those? The machine? You want one? No.
You come home, turn on that television.
Take one. I don't want one. No, they're good. I don't want it.
What do you want? You want comedy?
Take one. No, stop. Kramer, stop it.